that. Joining me now, Time Magazine's Newton-Small and the Nation's John Nichols, with a welcome to both of you. You know, Jay, I'm going to reach out to you first because I know that you covered John McCain for like a decade and a half. What are some of your most distinct memories of that?
Alex, I remember meeting him in 2003 in the Capitol, and I was sort of a young cub reporter, just starting to cover politics, and all the other reporters would say, oh, if you want an anti-Bush quote, go to John McCain, because at that point he was still really smarting from his 2000 loss, and that was sort of a very classic McCain, where he had this temper, and he could, he would get mad at losing that election, at the way that Bush won that election, and for a long time was very much, sort of very critical of Bush for the first years after that election, but then he forgives you, and he forgave Bush clearly by the 2004 election. He was out campaigning for George W. Bush, and I certainly experienced that myself. There are some stories that I wrote about him over the years where I would write things he did not like, and he would get really mad at me, and we would be in scrums in the Capitol where you have all these reporters around, and he would, and I would try to ask him a question, and he would be like, no, everybody else gets a question, but not you, Jay. And it would go on for a month or two, and then he would forgive me, and he would be like, well, I guess you can ask a question now.
Yeah.
But the thing was is that we always wanted to ask him questions because he was so smart, and he always had, such erudite answers on things. He always had such great lines. He always knew the sort of political soul of where we were going, and even when he got mad, or even when he didn't appreciate things, he always respected me, and he would always come back, and he would always sort of say, yeah, okay, let's make our peace, and he would still come back and give me interviews. So he was, I really miss him.
Well, I can tell that you agree that Straight Talk Express, which was, of course, his campaign bus, the slogan when he was running for president in 2000, was appropriately titled. I mean, he'd let you know how he felt. Wouldn't mince words, right?
Absolutely. There were times where there example, he felt that the Time magazine cover on him early, it would have been the end of 2006, calling him the front runner for the Republican nomination in 2008, kind of cursed him in a way, and he kind of blamed us for that. And so for a while in the summer of 2007, he banned Time magazine reporters from his bus because he was still mad at us. But the thing was that we really loved about him, and I think you'll always love about him, and why reporters flock to him, is that he was unabashedly he would just say his mind and what he thought was right and what he thought was the smart path. And there were times where politics intervened in that, and he would later regret it, and he would come back, for example, during the 2000 campaign, when he didn't come out against the Confederate flag in South Carolina. He later corrected himself and said, you know what, I was wrong.
He's done that.
Yeah, he's done that a few times in his life, where he said, you know what, I've done things for politics, I really regret, I'm going to come back and I'm going to correct it, and I'm going to, for the record, say that I shouldn't have done it that way. And he was very noble in that sense. You don't see a lot of politicians saying, hey, you know what, I was wrong, and I did this for politics, and I shouldn't have done it that way.
Especially not today. John, your thoughts, your perspective on all this?
Sure, I had something of a unique perspective because I come from Wisconsin and came up covering Senator Russ Feingold, and of course, John McCain aligned with Russ Feingold very early in Feingold's Senate career. It's a fascinating thing that McCain was a maverick, but he was a fascinating maverick. He would look around the Senate for people he thought might be straight shooters like him, might be willing to work with him on issues. And it didn't matter if they were on the other side of the partisan divide or the ideological divide. He found Feingold in the mid-1990s. They aligned on campaign finance reform. I covered the two of them throughout that process and covered both of McCain's presidential races. And one of the interesting things about it is I would always ask him, as he was running for president in 2000, again in 2008, would he put Feingold in his administration? And he would always tell me, don't ask that question. It'll just hurt me with Republicans. But he would never dismiss it, and it's a fascinating thing. I don't know that he would have put Feingold in his administration. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that if John McCain had ever become president of the United States, there is simply no question he would have had a one-nation administration that brought Democrats and Republicans in, and that had some liberals in it, despite his own deep, deep conservatism. And that made him almost unprecedented on the American political stage.
John, how did he carry himself? because, you know, listening to Jay, listening to the many people with whom I've spoken over the last 24 hours, and they speak of him, there's a air of affection by some, respect, all of that, but he was really just sort of like your normal guy coming down the hallway, right? He didn't walk as if he was 10 feet taller than everybody else.
Well, no, and he could have, of course, because he had such incredible personal history. And remember, he's a multi-generational military leader, and so he could have had lots of errors, if you will. But that wasn't who he was. He was a very human, very humane character. Remember, he had many physical challenges as a result of his long military service and his imprisonment. And so he couldn't move his arm in certain ways. There were all sorts of things. And he always built around it so that people who met him didn't feel uncomfortable. He would move to the side that made it easiest for him to put his arm around somebody. He would bend down to a child if a kid wanted to talk to him. He's always there to sign an autograph. But I will tell you one other thing that's absolutely fascinating about John McCain, and why journalists couldn't help but be fascinated by the guy and engaged with him. And that is, he would always answer a question. And there were times, famously, where he would be in a car with another senator, maybe going to some event, and there would be a call for the other senator. The other senator didn't want to answer. McCain would say, "Oh, give me the phone." He was always ready to talk about any issue.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, Jay, John, for sharing your thoughts and recollections of John McCain. I know he'll be very missed by you both. Let's go now to politics. And